Hello, everyone, and welcome to Virtual Insights Making Multitudes. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon from across time zones, New York, and as we saw in the chat, many countries. My name is Persephone Allen, and I'm Curator of Programs and Engagement at the American Folk Art Museum. As many of you know, our museum is dedicated to uplifting the work of self-taught artists across time and place. And we're thrilled to celebrate our 60th anniversary with our recently opened exhibition, Multitudes, now on view at our galleries at 2 Lincoln Square through early September. We are excited to explore this exhibition with you virtually today, and we also hope that you'll make plans to visit in person and to book your tickets, which are available to reserve online for free. We're grateful for opportunities like this to connect online, which would not be possible without the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and all of you. Thank you for donating to sustain ongoing virtual experiences like this one, our 60th milestone, and all of the incredible events we've organized this year. As we begin today's program, I want to acknowledge that I am both joining from and our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and we are committed to advancing and centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. Today, Multitudes exhibition co-curator and curator of folk art, Emelie Gevalt, will introduce us to the art, artists, and ideas behind this expansive new exhibition that she and AFAM's senior curator, Valerie Rousseau, have organized to tell the story of 6 decades of collecting at the American Folk Art Museum. Following Emelie's talk, we'll open up the discussion for Q&A, so we hope that you share your questions freely. We invite you to submit questions throughout the program by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and we'll make every effort to respond to as many of these as possible at the end. This afternoon's program is being recorded, so we will publish it online on our YouTube and Vimeo channels after the program, and we hope you'll revisit it. Closed captioning in English can be activated by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And our thanks today to Director of IT, Richard Ho, for invaluable technical support. As many of you know, will know, today's program was originally planned as a conversation, and we do look forward to sharing a second talk with Senior Curator of Self-Taught Art, Valerie Rousseau, at a later date, so please stay tuned. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Emelie Gevalt, our Curatorial Chair for Collections and Curator of Folk Art at the American Folk Art Museum, who will be familiar to many of you who've joined us for past programs online as the coordinating curator of our recent exhibition, American Weathervanes, The Art of the Winds, and our current traveling exhibition, American Perspectives, Stories from the American Folk Art Museum Collection. In addition to her curatorial work, Emelie is also a doctoral candidate in American art history at the University of Delaware, where her research explores 18th and 19th century American portraiture, decorative painting, the Colonial Revival movement, and African-American material culture and representation through the lens of 20th century histories of collecting and collective memory. We are excited and honored to share this virtual space with all of you, and I'd like to invite Emelie now to begin.
Thank you so much, Persephone, for the lovely introduction, and welcome to everyone from parts near and far. I'm thrilled to be speaking with you today about Multitudes, which is an exhibition that celebrates AFAM's 60th anniversary while also looking analytically at the museum's collections through an expansive presentation of a diversity of objects made by folk and self-taught artists across time and place. With over 400 individual works of art in the show, I think it's safe to say that Multitudes is one of the largest displays of objects from AFAM's collections ever installed at our flagship gallery at 2 Lincoln Square. And I really hope that you'll be able to make it to the show in person to see these works made by over 80 different artists from the 18th to the 21st centuries. And I'll start with just a brief thematic overview before we delve into some individual object histories. The idea of Multitudes is intended to provide a lens onto the collection to consider it from 2 related perspectives. First, we have the idea of the museum itself as a collection of multitudes, a project constructed by multiple minds over 6 decades of the museum's history, including collectors, curators, art dealers, and artists. Second, we look at the concept of multitudes encapsulated within the artistic process itself, as a maker often draws on repetitive gestures, repetitive images and ideas to express a sense of multiplicity within a single object or a series of objects. And you'll find throughout the galleries that works of art are displayed in clusters of like objects in order to evoke these ideas. Now, these two perspectives often overlap. I think both are well represented in an example like this display of Pennsylvania German fracture drawings, and they're really reflected throughout our galleries as well. From an individual artist's body of work to specialized subcategories, including quilts, portraiture, fracture, art environments, hand-tinted photographs, and trade signs, the museum's holdings truly comprise a collection of collections. This range of subcategories is really a reflection of how folk art collecting history has evolved over time. So I'll start with a note here about that history of collecting, for those of you who may be less familiar. Whereas the history of Western fine art has had a long established hierarchy of artistic media and subjects, during the early 20th century, the boundary-breaking modernist movement really changed popular understandings of what could be considered art. During that time, especially in the 1920s and the 30s, a new collecting category known as folk art and later self-taught art and art brut emerged as frameworks which made space for diverse creative expressions that were typically excluded from the formal art historical canon. So the use of this category of folk art as an umbrella term is one of the reasons that the museum encompasses such a broad range of objects. Many of these objects considered folk art were seen as rediscoveries. For instance, things like shop signs, examples of what you're seeing here, as well as bed covers, originally made for functional purposes, were freshly appreciated for their craftsmanship and their aesthetic power. The works of self-taught artists, often previously limited to local or family audiences, were now exposed to a wider community of art lovers. Collectors during this time developed expertise in concert with the greater recognition of makers and delved deeper into individual object histories as more material was brought into the marketplace. At the American Folk Art Museum, which was founded in 1961 by dedicated collectors, dealers, and scholars, some of the first objects to enter the museum's holdings represented some of the touchstones of the invention of the folk and self-taught fields. And many works seen in multitudes, including things like wildfowl decoys, needlework, quilts, and trade signs, such as those seen here, exemplify the iconic status now afforded to certain folk art categories due to their craftsmanship and striking graphic appeal. Today, I'll take you through a range of some of my favorite objects in the show and share aspects of their histories among the multitudes. I will be focusing in greatest detail on historical works that are under my own area of expertise, but I will also share glimpses of contemporary objects, which you can see in the show and hear more about in upcoming programs, including part 2 of this program with my colleague and co-curator, Valerie Rousseau. But let's start with a discussion of some of these trade signs. Emblematic trade signs have a long history. They date all the way back to the ancient world. There was actually a wonderful article about some discoveries of painted trade signs in Pompeii in the recent New Yorker article. But they really also became very popular during the Middle Ages in Europe, especially during a time when literacy was not necessarily something that you could expect from every urban visitor. A large and well-executed trade sign was an essential way of communicating the services that a business could provide. So easily interpreted symbols like a tooth for a dentist and a sheep for a tailor or a wool dealer instantly advertised the purpose of a business. In the early 20th century, Americana collectors began to recognize the strong graphic appeal of these objects, really as works of sculpture that also told an important story about the history of business and entrepreneurial culture in the United States. Within the history of folk art as a developing collecting category, carved trade signs were identified alongside things like weathervanes and decoys as significant contributors to an American tradition of sculpture that had often been overlooked by the fine art world. Key collectors whose names you might recognize, like Abby Aldridge Rockefeller and Electra Havemeyer Webb, as well as AFAM's own Adele Ernest, who was the founder of the museum in the 60s. These women helped to make trade signs really essential to their collections and to the folk art collecting movement. The examples that you're seeing here each came to AFAM as gifts from individuals, which really underscores the importance of private collectors in shaping the field of folk art as well as the museum's collection. The tooth was gifted to the museum in the 80s and was probably advertising a dentist shop. We know that there are a number of tooth trade signs that have survived from the 19th century. Most of them date to the second half of that century because dentistry as a specialized practice didn't actually develop until later. Before the mid-19th century, somewhat frighteningly, dentistry was really the purview of a country doctor who was responsible for everything from obstetrics and surgery to the pulling of teeth. So the tooth trade sign really seems to have emerged with the specialty of dentistry. The sheep, or the golden fleece, has been an emblem of wool and cloth dealers all the way back to the 15th century. And we can still see this today in emblems like the Brooks Brothers emblem, which itself dates to the early 19th century. AFAM's finely executed example, which has this really wonderful textured wool that you can see carved into the wooden components of this evocative trade sign. It was once painted and shows traces of paint as well as gold leaf. The baseball player, which is an exceptionally finely carved example, was made by Samuel Anderson Robb, a New York City maker of trade signs, who really developed a recognizable style of figure carving, often for advertising tobacco and other store-bought goods. This particular figure may represent a famous baseball player named Michael King Kelly, who played for the team known as the Boston Bean Eaters. And just as an aside, being from Boston myself, I am especially glad that team name did not survive, but this beautiful and really very lively figure with a strong sense of personality certainly did survive. In a crowded city, a panoply of trade signs like these, which would have hung overhead or stood outside of a shop door, really contributed to a bustling commercial atmosphere with various businesses competing for one another visually for customers and for space in the urban landscape. The repeated use of familiar emblems, especially like the tooth and the sheep, also made it easy for patrons to locate the services that they were looking for. Repetition is another theme that you will see resurfacing throughout the exhibition, from the quiet power of two women seated side by side in this extraordinary stone sculpture of the biblical figures of Martha and Mary, made by William Edmondson, to the bold and joyful reiteration of similar motifs in this textile on the right, known as our pointing hands quilt. This was a recent acquisition in 2020, and we're thrilled to be sharing it with you all for the first time, debuting this work in multitudes. Hands are potent symbols in multiple traditions, often serving to call the viewer to attention or referencing themes of friendship, welcome, and trust. due to the improvisational and wonderfully asymmetrical quality of this quilt, we believe that this pointing hands quilt was made by an African-American quilter. And in African-American folk cultures, the term hand can refer to a protective charm. We can't confirm, we do not know the history of this quilt or its maker, so we likely will never be able to truly understand the quilter's intentions, but I think that this dynamic repetition of the pointing hand may well have drawn on one or more of these meanings in folk tradition. And certainly the varied repetitions make for a wonderful visual impact, which really draw the viewer into this network of alternating patterns and directions. And you can see in a detail here that the fabrics are not all the same. Some of the hands feature different types of fabric and different alternating directions of stripes and circles, which make for an even more dynamic quality to this exciting textile. Moving along on the thread of quilts, which comprise one of the museum's most important sub-collections at over 600 quilts in AFAM's holdings. Here's another spectacular example, which speaks very much to the theme of repetition and multiplicity. This is known as a sunburst quilt. It was actually found by the donors in a barn outside of Philadelphia. And it's one of 2 quilts in the museum's collection and part of a larger group of 6 in total that are associated with the woman Rebecca Scattergood Savory, who is a member of a prominent Quaker family from Philadelphia. Amazingly, this particular quilt has almost 3,000 individual pieces in it, made up of diamonds of various different fabrics, which you can see in close up here. It would have been a very complex quilt to execute, as you might imagine. In this particular case, the quilter relied on a method known as paper template or English quilting to achieve this intricate design of concentric circles, or really, I think, concentric octagons. In this particular paper template pattern, the cloth actually the pattern would have started out by using paper cutouts as the basis for each of these small pieces. And the cloth would have been basted to the paper, and then the pieces overstitched to one another. And then finally, once everything had sort of come together, the paper would have been removed. As you can imagine, it would have been very challenging to create consistency to this very elaborate design, and using the paper template system allowed the quilter to retain uniformity with the geometric shapes, even though they're all being joined together in an elaborate overall design. Like all quilting projects, but I think with this particularly complex one in particular, this is something that would have required an enormous amount of patience, as the quilter reiterates the same steps in succession over a period of days or even years to finalize the completed quilt. In our atrium, we chose to display 4 quilts in tandem to provide a snapshot of the continuity and innovation of this medium over time. And here you can see in the top left and bottom right, 2 early 19th century quilts made in the Anglo-American traditions of New England. These quilts are made of glazed wool. They're known as whole cloth quilts, which is to say not pieced, but very, very intricately quilted with gorgeous sort of scrolling vines and foliate patterns that you can see in the background here. And this is, I hope, unexpectedly and playfully set in contrast to much later examples of quilts made in the 1980s and the early 2000s by African-American women in Mississippi and Alabama, which both play on a traditional format known as the log cabin, but really make the tradition their own in these 2 very expressive examples by quilters Lucy Mingo and Pecolia Warner. And I'll just share some close-up shots of two of these examples. Really think that using fabrics ranging from this glazed wool on the left to cotton and synthetics on the right, and even denim in the example at bottom left, you can see how these quilts exemplify the timelessness of the tradition while also demonstrating these objects' power to meet the needs of individual expression in changing ways over the decades and even centuries. The use of different systems of organization and control is another theme that runs throughout the show, evident in diverse objects such as on the right, this compelling book of calculations by contemporary artist Jean-Daniel Allanche, and at left, a schoolgirl map likely made in New England in the 1830s. Let's take a closer look at this map. In 19th century New England, there was really a very important rise in geographical interest and geographical education. And during this time, map making skills were emphasized for both girls and boys as a way of expressing command of certain kinds of knowledge that were considered especially important. And here you can see that the maker has allocated particular animals, local animals to individual continents to show a mastery of geography and an understanding of the natural world. So in a sense, I think we can see the concept of map making as a way to create a sense of control over one's environment. But in this case, the maker's stereotyped images of indigenous peoples, which you can see interspersed with the animals in this map, creates or exposes really the limits and biases of her worldview in early 19th century New England. In ways similar to the map, this incredibly detailed Noah's Ark made of bone is also very much an object that organizes and controls. And this is something that you really should come and see in person at the museum, because you can't quite appreciate from a photo the intricacy of these different pairs of animals which are set up to advance into the ark. There's actually a crank which originally would have been intended to allow the animals to move forward and progress in an orderly fashion into the protective ark, which will shelter them from the oncoming flood. So this action of turning the crank really gives the user the satisfaction of physical authority over the numerous pairs of miniature figures. This work, as I mentioned, is made of bone and was probably created by a prisoner of war or a mariner, where working in bone to make intricate objects like this was a way of passing time, also familiar in works of Scrimshaw. Although made under distinct circumstances, I think both of these objects reflect a common cultural fascination with systemization and regulation as a means of giving shape to and controlling the sometimes overwhelmingly multitudinous natural world. Also making use of systems and repetition are works of art ranging from this incredible wrapped yarn sculpture by Judith Scott to early American objects like mourning pictures and needlework pictures that you're seeing on the opposite wall. All of these objects used reiterated physical movements, the pulling of thread or the gliding of the brush, and in needlework pictures especially used familiar graphic formats to record accomplishments and document family milestones in education and in births, marriages, and deaths as particular moments of importance in a family's life. These needlework pictures are among some of my favorite objects in AFAM's collections. And part of what I love about them is how they record memories of lives that aren't readily available to us elsewhere in the documentary archive. Very few records survive to document early American girls' lives, and pictures like these are rare material manifestations of their daily experience. I also am really captivated by the way that the repetitive movements of sewing, the makers of these works of art really actively embodied the values that were meant to be adopted through the making of these works, values of diligence and patience and industry, as the girl made stitch after stitch after stitch to complete a complex work like this. You can also see in a comparison like this one how in creating compositions that were variations on common themes, seen here in the rolling hills and the prettily dressed figures and the animals and plants that are quite similar, you really have a sense of an expression of shared identity and taste. Both of these needlework pictures were made in New England, in Massachusetts. And it's striking to see the continuity of these themes across a period of several decades, with one example on the left being made in the 1740s and the second in the late 1780s. You can also really see the pride and accomplishment as the two makers of these particular works have added their names to the pictures. Hannah Carter is the name embedded at the bottom here, and Ruthie Rogers at the bottom of this needlework sampler from Marblehead. Just to go back just one moment, I'll just, these particular examples were made respectively in Boston and in the prosperous town of Marblehead on the coast just north of Boston, which each had strong needlework instructors in the 18th century. These further two examples pick up on the common theme of representing houses, which we see in needlework pictures across the 18th and early 19th centuries. And these two examples were made also north of Boston. The example on the left in Newburyport, which just does such a wonderful job, I think, of conveying the local architecture with this incredibly accurate representation of a federal period house. If you go up to Newburyport or Salem, you will see houses just like this. And then on the right, a sampler, which also picks up this common theme of representing architecture, made by a girl called Hannah Staples, probably in the vicinity of Portland, Maine, just a bit before the needlework on the left. A major subject across AFAM's collections is the representation of different characters, whether in the form of imagined personages or portrait likenesses. And the display of these casts of characters, whether in the form of imagined or a fictional or real, is really one of the most compelling aspects of the exhibition process for me and Valerie, as we got to spend time with and come to understand the personalities behind various bodies of work and individual images in the collection. In the foreground here, you're seeing just part of an incredible group of thousands of figures crafted by a self-taught artist named Annie Hooper, who was motivated in part by emotional distress to populate her home with these sculptures, some of which draw upon biblical characters to create really another world peopled with these characters. And in the background of this image, you see a succession of portraits by 19th century painter Ammi Phillips, who in his own way represented characters of his own by creating likenesses of members of his community in rural New England and New York from the 1810s until his death in the 1860s. Now, portraiture, of course, is a very different kind of artistic project than creating fictional characters, because of course, these images were intended to capture individual likenesses. At the same time, the commonalities between examples of this form can be really striking. They forge visual connections between sitters through the use of comparable formats, poses, clothing and expressions, which you're seeing, I think, in particular here with this very similar pair of portraits of gentlemen, an unknown gentleman on the left and George Sunderland to his right. And I think these distinctions and similarities convey a desire to align oneself with one's community, to align oneself with like-minded neighbors, even in the course of expressing individuality and creating a record of the particular likeness of a loved one. Ammi Phillips was a prolific portraitist who painted hundreds of likenesses over the course of his career. AFM is fortunate to possess 12 of these, which really represent the range of work that he created in rural towns along the borders of New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, where he himself formed a member of the community over the years. And unlike some other painters working in the folk idiom during this time, he was not, he was itinerant in some sense, in that he did change communities over the years, but he was not traveling sort of from one day to the next. He would settle within a town and paint his neighbors over a period of several years. One especially important example in AFM's collection is this picture, which represents a kind of Rosetta Stone for research on the artist. This portrait is actually signed on the reverse, which was certainly by no means always the case for Phillips and his contemporaries. And this signature provided a key link in the 1960s, which brought together Phillips's oeuvre under a single name when it had previously been thought to be created by three different artists, previously known as the Border Limner and the Kent Limner. It was thought that these were three different hands, but pioneering researchers Barbara and Larry Holdridge, working together with Mary Black, a former director of the American Folk Art Museum, together discovered the connections between these different, supposedly different bodies of work. And the link was the discovery of this picture of George Sunderland found in an antique shop. Together, this team of scholars went on to mount the foundational show on the artist in the 1960s at the American Folk Art Museum, which has continued to be at the forefront of Phillips scholarship. The recent gift to the museum, and I should say the Sunderland portrait is also a relatively recent gift to the museum, but the recent gift of this iconic portrait of a boy adds to this particular strength of AFM's in representing the work of Ammi Phillips as an iconic American folk artist. This is an exceptional example of the artist's oeuvre, especially at the early point of his career. A depiction of the young Frederick A. Gale is a highly unusual example of one of Phillips's full-scale compositions, which he created more of at this early moment in the 1810s. You will find other examples of this particular format in museum collections, such as the Harvard Museums and the Clark in Williamstown. But you can very readily recognize that this is from an early moment in his career, with the ethereal pale background characteristic of this moment in his development, and the luminous quality of this work, which you can see especially well in some of these detail shots, expresses Phillips's ability to capture the beauty and emotional power of a child's simultaneous innocence, mystery, and liveliness. And these absolutely wonderful details of bright red set against dark green speak to his ability as well to capture light and color in an especially expressive way. There are so many more casts of characters and collections of collections to be found in Multitudes, and I really hope that my remarks today have whet your appetite to visit in person. I do want to leave some time for questions, and I'm also happy to share other works from the show as they may come up and be relevant to questions that you have. But this is just a bit of a sneak peek Throughout the exhibition, we have really sought to display in visually compelling ways and through surprising juxtapositions, the diversity and exceptional range of the museum's collection, as well as the breadth of creativity and the determination to create amongst these artists, representing various times, places, and materials in the field of folk and self-taught art. But it looks like we have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and I want to see if we can get to some of those.
Well, I'll just jump in to say thank you so much, Emily, for this incredibly rich introduction to this show, which is, I think, your talk really helped us to understand how expansive and wide-ranging it is. And this is the point where we'd love to invite questions from you, the audience. I know that we already have a number in the Q&A, and we hope that you'll continue to share with us what you're curious about and want to learn more. So to start us off, there was a lot of interest in the embroideries, and it was so wonderful to be able to see those up close and high resolution photographs. Could you speak to, I think to start us off, just how we're able to see these works in such pristine condition? Do we know how they were displayed both by the artists, and then how they were maintained until this moment? Would they have been shown publicly? Would these things have been more private?
Absolutely, these were public objects, and I think you see that as well in examples of that are even more ambitious than these. Girls with access to needlework instruction in places like Boston in particular would sometimes make what's called an overmantel or chimney piece scale needlework picture, which you can see examples of, and especially fine examples of in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. This would have been, really a 3 foot long needlework picture. So they were intended for public display, or I should say domestic display, but within the public rooms of a house. They were really meant to signal a girl's accomplishments and would have occupied pride of place in the family home. They were framed during the time period. And so I think that sense of importance of these objects is something that would have caused them to be protected by future generations and passed down. These are in exceptionally good condition. And that is not always the case for needlework and samplers that survive, but the elaborate nature of these examples is probably something else that caused generations within the family, or eventually purchasers of works like this in the early 20th century to recognize that they needed to be well preserved. And really the key thing that you can do for works like this is to keep them out of the light in order to preserve their vibrant colors. And of course, in the examples of fabrics that are made of animal proteins, it would have been important to keep these protected from things like moths as well. But we're very fortunate to have such beautifully vibrant and well preserved examples in the collection.
And I think those practical considerations, moths, light, things that we don't necessarily think of first, but are so key. When you mentioned that exposure to light would impact these works, these are both silk thread on linen, and the Hannah Staples sampler being, so much more of that brown. In these two examples, are we seeing, is that likely the effect of light exposure, or is this just
good question,
more of the linen ground, whereas the needlework?
Yes, it's a little bit of both. The needlework picture, there's a distinction and sort of in between attempting something as a sampler and attempting something like the image that you're seeing on the left, which is really intended as a fully pictorial composition. And so the needle worker would have really covered every aspect of the linen ground. The sampler, you are indeed seeing more of that linen ground in between the, the letters and the different motifs. So I would venture to say, though, as well, that the staple sampler has, you can see there's some staining to it over the years. Before it entered the museum's collection, it wasn't, I think, perhaps preserved quite as well as this exceptionally vibrant picture from Newburyport.
Well, it's a really great juxtaposition to sort of be able to see different examples of works from similar time periods. And we have another question, just thinking about these objects as rich material records of young women's lives. Do you know of any diaries or textual records in connection with any of the women in our collection, or that are attached to samplers, perhaps at other institutions?
Not in particular with these samplers, but there's some wonderful research that has been that's been done to. One example that I can speak to is a book by the textiles curator at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Pamela Parmall, who's written extensively on Boston needlework pictures. It's rare to have, a diary talking about needlework that relates directly to a surviving example, but certainly there are instances that exist, documents relating to the history of needlework teaching and schoolgirls who were under the instruction of particular needlework instructors, which survive. And I recommend having a look at the work of Pamela Parmall, as well as Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who has written extensively about some particularly elaborate needlework made by a Connecticut woman named Prudence Punderson, whose body of work is just extraordinary. There's a series of works created by her around the Revolutionary period that are all pictorial, and she did keep a diary. So that is one of the most exciting and interesting records that we have of one woman's body of work.
Incredible. I think that there's a lot of interest in these objects. And one other question that has come into the Q&A is, do we know who would have provided the image, or if a cartoon would have been used for the needlework picture from Newburyport?
Yeah, great question in general. To speak generally on this, absolutely. Needlework instructors, many of whom actually, especially in the early years of the British American colonies, would come over from England, having already become successful instructors in England, and they would bring patterns with them, many of which drew upon period prints, and also just on a very long tradition. There's this tradition of pastoral imagery dates back to the 17th century. So you very much see a carrying over of English traditions, even this far into American history. But I think especially in an early example like this 1748 canvas work picture, I'm not aware of any particular visual sources for something like this Newburyport picture. But I think we can't underestimate the influence that the school mistress or the instructor would have had on helping the girl to lay out a composition. But there was also really a broad range, and depending on how old a girl was or how talented she might be, on what would be expected of her in terms of making choices about a composition. And this really represents an especially accomplished endeavor with this particular example. And you do see the markers of local imagery and local architecture. So it's not just a matter of copying, Anglo-European precedents. There's absolutely influence of particular buildings and sometimes particular people. surfacing in these works.
Well, and I think moving from composition to materiality, we have questions here both about who would have made the silk thread, would it have been spun by these young women, and then moving beyond silk and linen, we also have a question here about cotton and thinking about materials that would have been made by enslaved peoples, and how that kind of where we're bringing that narrative into the museum's interpretation, and how it factors into these works.
Yes, really good questions. Of course, Atlantic world trade, especially with the Caribbean in the 18th century. This was all part of a system of complicity with enslaved labor. With respect to the thread that was used in these particular works, there are records of, for an ambitious work like this, for a girl who would have come from a wealthy family, or for examples that make use of threads with precious metals in them, gold thread, silver thread. We have records of purchases or expenses for materials from girls from, especially elite families in Boston and on other urban centers, indicating that, they wouldn't have been, in many cases, directly involved with the making of the materials. But certainly spinning was also an important skill. And again, to direct you to Laurel Thatcher Ulrich and her book, The Age of Homespun, I believe it is, which has a chapter on this, on not only Prudence Punderson, but an incredible chimney piece made by a girl from the Otis family of Barnstable, Mass. You can read more about competitions that girls and women engaged in at the time for spinning. But there were absolutely distinctions in terms of what sort of socioeconomic level your household was operating at in terms of where you would have sourced materials, or whether they would have been made directly within a household economy.
Thank you. This is, we have a comment that in the Q&A where someone is reflecting on the fact that one of the needlework pieces was done by an 11-year-old. And I think it is really, it's just incredible to think about the skill here, and it does transport us back in time in a way, I think. So I just want to share that because I agree, that's really quite remarkable. And we do.
That's right. Ruthie Rogers is perhaps the person that that is she would have been 11. She was born in 1778. So it's pretty exceptional when you realize the work that these girls were doing at such an early time in their lives.
Absolutely. And I think just to respond also to questions about enslaved peoples and their role within the materials, a great exhibition that I know we've both seen was Fabric of a Nation at the MFA Boston, which really looks in particular at textiles and does a deep dive into some of those issues.
Yes, and I think you see that. I'm not actually certain with these particular works the degree to which enslaved labor would have been involved in the making of the dyes. I think because of the materials involved, wool, these would not have been, the actual fibers would not have been, I think in this case, directly impacted by enslaved labor, but it was all part of a triangular network. And New England, I think in particular, is often overlooked or kind of erased from complicity in the history of enslaved labor in the 18th century because it was not necessarily directly enslaving as many people as elsewhere in the Atlantic world at that time. but through the supply of goods and the supply of food being brought from New England to the Caribbean, there was absolutely an inextricable link between all of the domestic and economic activities taking place in New England and the enslaved labor that was providing a source of wealth. So not to want to move away from that question, but I think in this particular case with these works, it's more about the entanglement of wealth and resources than any particular material link with the fibers used in these pictures.
And I know that your own research is really dedicated to exploring the interconnectedness of this time,
Yes.
those entanglements, the complicity. So we couldn't
Yes.
have a better person to be speaking with about the complexities of these works.
Well, and you'll see too, sorry, and I don't want to monopolize the Q&A with this question, but it's just so fascinating to me. I do think, again, if you look to the works of Prudence Punderson, there's an absolutely incredible example of a needlework that she made, which does picture a Black woman who may have been someone living in the Punderson household. And you do see Black figures appear rarely, but surprisingly frequently, I think, in terms of kind of the popular understanding of enslavement in New England, you do see Black figures appear in these works.
It's remarkable. They're just, you know, a real, a record, a rare record to have these. And I think, so in terms of records, and I do want to be able to share some of the questions that are speaking to other aspects of the exhibition. And this is a question that I know would be one also for Valerie, but do we know how many artists in the exhibition are still living, because it is spanning the 18th century to the contemporary moment?
Yes, I mean, I do think there are, for my part, Lucy Mingo, born in 1931, is, I think, the one living artist represented amongst the traditional forms or the traditional media. I think there are a number of artists who are living amongst the contemporary collections. I can't, I'm afraid, actually pinpoint a number, but
so a question for part two.
Yes,
but while we're here with the quilts, we do have a question about the Savory quilt and process. And do you know whether with a quilt like this, would she have started piecing from the center or worked from the edges inwards?
Oh gosh, I have no idea. That's a great question though. I don't know. I'm sure there was a way that I don't know, maybe there was a quilter in the audience who knows the answer. I am sorry to say I am not a quilter, but it absolutely would have required some very careful advanced planning, and she probably would have looked to tradition to make a decision about that, because these were very much these processes, not only the patterns, but very much the processes were passed down from one generation to the next.
I think that, and you spoke about this in your introduction, also just that these are artists, many of whom were not part of traditional art historical records. And so the materials that are available to us on them look differently. And the amount of information, sometimes, you know, a family was able to keep those records and sometimes it's less.
Right. Often the only record that we have is really the material record of the object itself.
And speaking of materials, we have a question that is sort of riffing off of the Ammi Phillips portraits. Could you speak to materials that were used in portraiture? We have both the Ammi Phillips and then a number of 19th century portraits. These are all oil paints, but other types of materials that would have been popular and accessible and affordable at this time.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I don't think I have an example of one of the watercolors from the show. Well, I can maybe share Here's just one example that showcases some of the other materials that were in use. But in portraiture, yes, oil on canvas was typical, but you also have examples of artists using, decorating all kinds of objects that were part of their daily lives, and using wood as a panel surface for a portrait, or illuminating sketchbook verse, as you see in this wonderful page from a sketchbook of a young girl, which uses watercolor. We also have a range of watercolor portraits in the show, which you will see, as I was discussing in Ammi Phillips, very much kind of draw on similar formulas and formats to create a kind of body of work built around a community's shared sense of taste. And watercolor was something that was an alternative, a cheaper alternative to a slow drying, more expensive, larger scale oil portrait, which became quite popular in the early 19th century through makers like Samuel and Ruth Shute, who were a husband and wife pair of itinerant watercolor portraitists, making works in places like the mill towns of Lowell, Massachusetts, where they would have had a ready audience of girls who were working in the mills and away from home for the first time, and had some measure of financial independence for the first time, and would have been able to, for a much smaller fee, commission a portrait of themselves. So this is really a period when portraiture, which had hitherto, in the form of an oil on canvas, been only available to a largely wealthy urban elite, and you start to have a much broader range of makers offering portraiture services, and a much broader range of clientele as a result of materials like watercolor on paper.
It's fascinating. And it's also really wonderful to have this view of the portraits all together, where we see that the repetition
Yes.
of poses, gestures, but then the individuality and personality of each of these works. To return to the quilts, we do have a question here about glazed wool. And I think that it is such a fascinating technique. Is it still used today? And is there a special process for giving the fibers particular qualities?
I don't know whether this is still a process that's regularly used today. It was really a favored material in the 18th and early 19th century, as you're seeing with both of these two examples, the center star quilt and the indigo quilt, which you can really see the sheen on. And a sheen like this could have been created through the use of an egg glaze, or even just the compression of the fabric and the pressing of it down. You can see this example has less of a sheen, and I'm not positive whether that's a result of just variability in wear over time, or a different degree of glazing. But it would have given kind of a sheen to a textile in kind of a dark interior environment. And also, not sure about this, but I would think perhaps offered a measure of resilience to staining.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to call attention to the chat that we had a lot of responses about piecing quilts, and there is a great deal of quilters knowledge in the room. We're so glad you're here, and grateful for sharing of that knowledge. I think this is a really fun question that comes to us, which is, could you speak to some of your favorite pieces from the show?
Yes, I love that question, because I do have a few extra slides at the end here, which I'll share. I won't speak too much about the individual works, but just to give you a snapshot, another sort of cluster of objects in the show are these works around the theme of the tree of life motif, which is sort of a universal metaphor that shows up in a lot of cultures, but you see it here reflected in a bed rug from New Hampshire in the early 19th century, a tree of life made in Pennsylvania German tradition. These wonderful works were often made to celebrate a birth in the family. Bed rugs, as we know, like quilts, were often made to celebrate, some kind of milestone, like a marriage. Textiles would be made for a young woman to bring into her new household. And so these themes of branching trees, and you see this too in paint decorated furniture, which often would have held expensive textiles. You see this kind of imagery of abundance and fertility, which would have been an auspicious type of pattern for a young woman on the brink of family life. Then taking that theme into sort of a little bit of another realm is this example of what's called a Shaker gift drawing, which was a kind of a spiritual a response to what the Shakers believed was kind of a divine communication. There's a group of Shaker women who believed that they were receiving divine visions and painted these examples of gift drawings, many of which show a range of different imagery, but this one in our collection shows a kind of tree of life motif as well. So I wanted to group these works together to express that continuity of similar theme. We also have this incredible work made by a carpenter who in his working life made utilitarian pieces, but in his retirement decided to turn his hand to these really incredible just confections of repetition and jubilant graphic repetition. There are a couple examples of this that actually were recently for sale at Christie's and Sotheby's. He had an extraordinary output of work, which was rediscovered, as it were, in the early 20th century by Adele Ernest. This work came to us in honor of Adele Ernest from her friend Cordelia Hamilton.
And
Stop
Emelie,
me if I'm taking too long.
That sunburst is also very, I think some of these objects, it's so useful to have those installation images, because when we look at this on a screen, it's so hard to get the sense of how tall and monumental that work is, and to imagine someone, working on that after work and crafting these pieces. I love this image also for the shadow that it casts on the wall. So I know that there are people who won't be able to see the show in person. And so this is a really wonderful chance to think about what these objects are like in person, and the impact that they have.
Yes.
But I see that we still have a few more favorite works. So I would love, while we still have time together, to hear a bit more.
Sure. Well, this is a phrenological head made by a known carver. Actually, the museum has hosted an important show on Asa Ames, whose work is in other collections, including the Huntington Museum in Los Angeles. This phrenological head, I think, really speaks to the idea of systems and attempts to kind of control information that is perhaps overwhelming in its multiplicity. And so, of course, as we now know, phrenology is a completely discredited idea with a lot of very troubling associations. But at the time that this sculpture was made, it would perhaps have represented a source of hope for the artist, who was suffering, we believe, from tuberculosis at the time, and would die soon after making this work. Which, if you look at it closely in person, you can see the different sections of the brain have been inscribed with different characteristics like conscientiousness or assertiveness, and following this pseudoscientific idea of phrenology, that the certain parts of the brain were directly responsible for different personality traits. This is another real favorite collection of collections. These whimsy bottles, which we have many more of these in the collection. Actually, I had to limit myself a little bit to what we could show, but you can see here, there are all kinds of things encapsulated in these bottles. This was a popular pastime, kind of like scrimshaw in a sense. This was, these objects were not made for any purpose other than the pleasure of making and the pleasure of owning. And they contain a delightful variety of whimsical objects, ranging from, a sculpture of Abraham Lincoln to a ship in a bottle to, there are a lot of themes of, there are religious themes as well as themes of seamstresses, which were quite common. But this was a popular pastime, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, when bottles were being produced at a greater number and were just very widely available. And you can see on the surface of the bottles what some of these were originally used for. One of them is a Listerine bottle, and one of them is obviously was for alcohol. And it's just, these are also, of course, bottles that are, they're riddles in themselves, because you look at them and you instantly think, gosh, how did that get in there? And that's part of the pleasure of looking at these as well. And just to share another pair of portraits, this is also a recent gift to the museum, this wonderful pair of twin boys, which I think you see both of their individual likenesses, but they've been captured in different backgrounds. So again, that sense of both commonality and distinction. I will not talk about the duck decoys or the wildfowl decoys, because I know we have some exciting programming coming up on these, but just to give you a taste, this is very exciting for us to be able to share this group of 25 birds from our collection of over 200 birds, which we recently evaluated as a group. And it was a lot of fun to make this selection of just absolutely gorgeous objects that have come to the collection over many years.
And Emelie, we did have a question here that asked if we had any work by Native Americans. And in this body of decoys, there is a decoy that's attributed to the Shinnecock community of Long Island.
That's right, yes. There are two birds in this selection that we believe are associated with a Shinnecock, possibly associated with Shinnecock makers. And of course, the origin of the wildfowl decoy is Native American. Native Americans made these out of local materials, have made them for thousands of years. That's something that we wanted to bring out with this display as well. And then I'll just share in Valerie's absence, another favorite of mine, which is from the contemporary portion of the collection, but I'm just totally captivated by these tiny sculptures, which are made out of organic materials like clementine peels and onion skins. You can get a sense for that there. This is clearly onion skin, but I'm just in sort of the realm of creating casts of characters. These objects have an incredible liveliness and personality to them that I think speaks very directly to some of the sense of multiplicity and of the multitudes that we wanted to capture with the show.
Well, I think Johnny Velarde's work is a perfect place to end today's program. Unless there, are any burning questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A. But this has been an incredible overview, so rich, and I think you've really invited us to join you in these conversations between objects that are from many different moments in time and different makers. And we want to thank everyone for your questions today, for joining us today. We hope that you'll come to see this exhibition in person if possible. There was a question in the chat if there is a catalog. There is not a catalog for this exhibition, but there will be more materials available online in the coming weeks. And we do hope that you'll join us online again soon for upcoming programs, including the Sunday, February 6th, we will have our Uncommon Anne Hill Blanchard Uncommon Artist Lecture exploring the work of William Edmondson, of Sister Gertrude Morgan, and Joseph Yoakum, really celebrated self-taught artists. And we'll hear from colleagues and scholars, Valerie Castle Oliver, Jennifer Jane Marshall, and Esther Adler. So I'll put the link for that program in the chat, as well as links to other upcoming programs. And we hope that you all stay well, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. This was a pleasure.